So we welcome back Malcolm, our good old friend that we haven't seen. I think last time we saw you, it was probably nearly a year ago. And I think that you were talking to us about how you were going into exhibitions last summer and events, and you were going to be doing lots of amazing things with regards to networking and talking and drumming up some extra education with regards to HVO, hydrotreated vegetable oils, for all of you that maybe don't know quite yet. But HVO has been something that we've also been on the trial for this winter. And again, it's our second time on the trial, and we've had really huge success with it. So Malcolm, how has the trial been going from your side, and what are the HVO updates?
Okay, well, I mean, you've been on the trial for 2 winters, and this is actually the 3rd winter that we've had homes converted to HVO as part of the trial. And we're up to 135 properties now. I mean, I think the honest answer is it's been a huge success. We haven't had any major problems. With 135 buildings converted, you'd expect 1 or 2 to have problems over the time period we've been working on. But so far, they've just been typical things that you'd expect from a heating system as a whole. A couple of people had the odd sort of minor problem, but nothing really that could potentially derail the basic plan, which was to show that HVO is a really excellent alternative to kerosene. And I think this has been something of a triumph for the industry. Actually, we've collaborated together. We've shown that the supply system works, and we've had homes and, in fact, a few non-domestic properties as well converted across in parts of the UK. I think that really speaks for itself now. You've got an industry that's got a good solution. And one that we're able to deliver at scale. I think we're in a very good place as a result of this project.
Yeah, we can definitely attest to that. This is our 2nd winter on the HVO trial. And I have to say, other than last year, I think we had one blip where we literally had something go wrong for 24 hours. And it was such a quick, easy fix, and really just wasn't anything even to mention. And this year, nothing. So then since last year, when we managed to get the settings right with our heat pump, which is, always the kind of master of issues. So once we managed to kind of get that sorted out and get that heat pump happy and talking and in a cohesive relationship with the HVO, let's say, this year, fantastic. No hiccups. Here we are sitting in snow outside. We've had snow. This is our 2nd day of deep snow, and very nice and warm and cozy in the house. And I would just say, how grateful we are that we're in that situation. There's a lot of people this winter that are not in that situation. Is that something that has kind of, because of the cost of living crisis and because of the amount of talking about the heating and how many people are struggling this year in the media, has that been something that's been able to kind of almost, excuse the pun, but fuel your ability to speak to the government about just how urgent it is that we get HVO available to people in homes?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's lots of really good points there. I mean, you're actually unique in terms of our trial in that you've got a hybrid system. I'm really pleased to see that that's working well, because that's another potential technical solution for some people, really. So, I think that's an important point to get in there. But you're right about the overarching sort of situation that we're facing in the country at the moment. We are in economically really challenging times. Households and communities off the gas grid. I think that this is a really important issue. I mean, it's important for everyone, frankly. I mean, I live in a town, and we're feeling the pinch too. And on a day when we've got snow here in Ipswich as well, it's really sensible and right that we're talking about heating and heating costs. A lot of people are feeling the pinch. In rural communities, typically incomes are less. A lot of Europe off-grid areas, incomes are between 10 and 20% lower than the national average. You've got higher sort of living costs as well, because obviously you have to travel around more to get to essential services and things like that. And you've got homes that are typically older, often built into unique designs. And as a consequence of that, they're often a little bit more expensive to heat, and they're much more difficult to convert. This is really the conversation we've been trying to have with the government. You, and I'm sure many people watching this will be aware, decarbonisation is absolutely the elephant in the room here. There's been a lot of very interesting sort of reports lately about how we're getting further and further behind in terms of meeting our goal of achieving net zero by 2050. And heating is front and centre of that goal, because it accounts for roughly 23% of our emissions. So we've really got to take action and do it fast. But you can only do it successfully if people can actually afford to do it, and if the solution is really one that they're going to want to embrace. We at OFTEC, and I think others too, are really quite concerned that the government's current plans, which would involve effectively outlawing the replacement of boilers in off-grid homes for 2026, is going to be very difficult. But for many of the reasons I mentioned, people have got less money to spend. People off the gas grid are generally more challenging because of higher living costs and lower earnings. And they've got houses that are difficult to convert. We think that there's a real case for saying you need more than one solution here. You actually ideally need a range of options that allow people to make the best choice for them, really. And it also promotes competition. We feel that heat pumps are obviously going to be a really important technology going forward. And we also think that other successful options like liquid fuels, like HVO, should be part of that mix too. And that's really been our message to the government this year.
Before we get on to heat pumps, the one biggest problem that we've seen with HVO is obviously the price point. And that still hasn't changed. So now you said that the trial's in its third year. And during that time, I'm sure there's been a lot of conversations with the government to see whether the tariffs and levies can be dropped on that. I've kind of kept one eye on the actual tariffs this year, and I saw that HVO was going for about £1.88, £1.90, somewhere around there per litre. Kerosene obviously is all over the radar. It hit £1 per litre, then dropped to about 75p. So there's still a huge difference between the two. And I know that George Eustice actually addressed Parliament with regards to HVO. Was part of that presentation something to get government to drop those levies and to try and make HVO more affordable? And for those that haven't actually heard about George Eustice's bill, could you just maybe elaborate and just explain a bit about it?
George Eustice is a member of Parliament for a constituency in Cornwall. Just by coincidence, really, quite a few of the buildings in his in one particular village, the village of Caherland, is in his constituency, and they've been converted to HVO as part of our trial. This is a block of 17 buildings throughout the village. We managed to persuade George to come and see the conversion that had taken place. He met a lot of people who have been involved in it, whether these are the field distributors, the people that have done the installation work for us, and also the actual villagers themselves. He was really, really struck by their enthusiasm for this project and for their concerns about the potential costs that they could face if the government were to go ahead with its current plans. So as a consequence of that, George has talked to us and talked to other people about what could be done. And really, he's embraced this idea that basically the incentives that are currently available to people who use HVO for transport should be also applied to people who are using it for heating. So that's effectively what he's done with his bill. He introduced this idea that should happen. And he's also, as part of the bill, suggested that the duty that is currently charged on HVO, which bizarrely isn't charged if you're using kerosene benzene, be taken away as well. If those two things are done, that has a very dramatic effect on the price of HVO that you would actually pay if you were buying it to use for heating. And it would reduce it to something much, much closer to the price of kerosene. Now, of course, as you rightly said, the price of kerosene has been all over the place this winter, and so as a consequence, I don't think I can say that the prices are going to match up if we wait these steps, but it's going to be dramatically closer. And I think once you do that, you can then do some much more accurate modelling, comparing what the installation cost would be to convert an existing boiler to HVO, which is very small, it's probably less than £500 to do it. And then you can compare the running costs against using a heat pump. And obviously you've got much higher capital costs with the heat pump. And the running costs, once you've got these incentives in place, are much more comparable. So over the sort of 15, 20-year lifespan of a typical product, you can crunch the numbers. And you can see that for most people, the HVO option is really going to be attractive if we get these support measures in place. The crucial point about the George Eustice idea is that this incentive scheme is cost neutral to the taxpayer, but it's basically an internal market for HVO that the distributors and suppliers manage. So effectively, the consumer will see very little impact, but they will get the benefit, which is really just a win-win, really.
So with regards to the boiler ban, what happens to that then?
If you've got a gas boiler, which I've got here because I live in a town, the government is saying currently that you can carry on replacing that boiler until 2035. But if you live in the countryside and you use an LPG boiler or a solid fuel boiler or an oil boiler, from 2026, in most cases, you won't be allowed to replace it. And instead, you'll be expected to put a heat pump in instead. But what we're saying is actually you should still be allowed to put in a boiler, providing it's run on a low carbon fuel like HVO. And the impact of that would mean that effectively you are installing a low carbon system. We're also saying that people like you who already got existing oil heating system should be allowed to convert and encouraged to convert to the new fuel. This is really important because we are falling behind on our net zero goal. We need to ramp up progress quickly. And the quickest way you can do that is by coming up with solutions that make it easy for people to embrace low carbon choices. If you've got an existing oil boiler and you can run it easily on HVO, that is an easy, quick win. The same goes for heat pumps too, I might add. If you want to encourage people to install heat pumps, surely the best place to start is where it's easy. Where I live here in Ipswich, there are a lot of housing estates that have been built probably since the Second World War or in the 1930s. But a lot of houses are of a similar type, with a similar design, which are actually relatively quick and easy to convert to heat pumps if you wanted to. We know that companies like Octopus Energy are looking at that kind of option to drive down the price of heat pump installation. And that makes a lot of sense to me. Why would you want to choose the hardest homes first? It just seems crazy.
Yeah, I have to say that one of our neighbours, obviously we live rurally, and one of our neighbours is in a property that was a completely new renovation about a few years ago. So everything inside of it's new. And one of the things that the renovation the developers put in was an oil boiler about 3 to 5 years ago. And so when our new neighbours moved in just a couple of years ago, one of the things that they wanted to do is that they saw that we had done the setup of the solar panels and the heat pump, and they came to us and said, is it working? What do you think? And we said, yeah, we've kept everything. We've kept the oil boiler because we're running off the HVO, and we've got the heat pump and the solar. It just means that we've got a more holistic system that we can just kind of mix and match and kind of move around when the markets move around. So it just makes it a lot more flexible for us. And the neighbors said to us that actually what they were going to do is they were going to put the heat pump in and the solar panels, but they said they kind of almost felt a little bit regretful that they were going to have to actually remove the oil boiler purely to get the grant back from the government. So obviously they can't keep that, but they said, it's a real shame because that oil boiler is only, about 3 to 5 years old. Barely been used. It's in really good nick, and it just seems like such a kind of waste to then just send that to landfill almost for no reason whatsoever, when they could have kept it and actually then had the option of just keeping it dormant, because I think they just wanted to stay off the heat pump for the time being, but then have the option, for example, next winter, if HVO does become more available to homes, for them to be able to have the HVO as well and be able to run a hybrid system. When you speak to the government, why is there just so much adamant resistance to hybrid systems? Why is this kind of an all or nothing approach that the government is having with regards to just heat pumps?
It's complicated, and I think that's partly one of the reasons why there's resistance to hybrids, because if you have two different types of heating appliance, you've obviously got more costs, particularly in terms of grant funding. It becomes more difficult to know, because you don't know which part of the system is delivering most of the heat. You're actually controlling it and making sure that people are only being rewarded for doing the right thing, and they are actually doing it. It's much harder to judge. I think that's been part of the resistance. I think the government's really quite keen to effectively say people should only have to make one big change, and then they're done. The simple way to do that, of course, is just to get rid of the existing appliance and put a heat pump in. The government thinks that that's the easiest way to basically say, right, that home is done. We don't have to worry about that place anymore. Life is much more complicated than that, isn't it? As you know, and we don't all necessarily want to go the whole hog in one go. If you live in an older property, particularly one that's not very well insulated, you may well want to have to do some other things to that building too, to really maximise the benefit of putting a heat pump in, because they tend to run best when they're not having to work too hard. And the best way to avoid that is by having a really well insulated home. And if you start putting heat pumps into older rural properties that are, have very poor energy efficiency, the running costs will be high. That is not going to be an outcome that's going to sell heat pumps to other people. They're going to hear these stories and they're going to be thinking, maybe I'm going to wait. And that's the one thing we don't want to do we? We want to make progress with decarbonisation quickly. To us, it makes much more sense to actually incentivise all these options and to give people choice and to really push ahead by supporting everything that could potentially work.
I remember one of the last conversations that we had, we spoke about kind of where HVO comes from. And I kind of have a vague recollection that you said that, a lot of the HVO that we get here in this country is coming from abroad, is coming from Europe, I think maybe you said. Is that changed? Is that kind of in the pipeline? Is that now developing? Is because maybe the government is starting to slowly warm up to HVO, are other parties now starting to become more interested in it locally in the UK?
And I know that Martin Cook mentioned that the United States was quite interested in shipping HVO here. So, has any progress been made on that front?
That's a good question. Yeah, well, I think the second part first. I mean, yes, there has been some big changes there. I mean, one of the barriers to importing HVO from outside of Europe was that because we were previously part of the EU, there was a scheme in place that basically prevented what was called fuel dumping. In other words, they didn't want cheap fuels being imported into the EU from other countries because that might potentially compete with EU production. So they didn't want things to come from America, for example. But now the UK is outside of America, we've actually kind of moved away from that, and we've said, yeah, it's actually fine to import these fuels. And we think that the first shipment from America is due very soon. So there is now potential to actually get fuel from a wider range of places, which is obviously good news because it means that could have a potential impact, a good positive impact on availability and price. It's obviously too early to say exactly how that will pan out, but I think ultimately that's a good thing. In terms of domestic production, it's still really sort of a bit stuck at the moment. There isn't much going on, I don't think, what I'm aware of, although there may be people doing work behind the scenes that I'm not aware of. There's always development all the time, and we can hope that is coming, but at the moment, I'm not aware of domestic HVO production. So most of what we get is still coming in from the near continent. I mean, there is a concern about that because, I think as we've seen with the Ukrainian crisis and the effect that's had across Europe, there's much more interest now in being self-sufficient for energy as much as possible as a country. And that obviously the more wind generation we can get, the better. That's going to really help us. But I think there is still potential to reduce local renewable liquid fuels. You could improve waste capture, for example. But I think realistically, I have to say, I don't think we could be self-sufficient for this kind of fuel because we're just probably not going to be able to capture enough used cooking oil and things like that to really produce enough. So I think we'll always be somewhat dependent on imports.
But that might still be the case. But we mustn't forget that it's very easy to greenwash electricity as well. I mean, obviously this winter we just had a couple of days of snow in the UK and we've had to turn the coal power plants on to support the grid as well. So even if you are, if you don't want to have HVO, but you want to stay on a heat pump, you've still got to be aware of where your actual energy is coming from. HVO, I know that there possibly is an argument that, if you're having to put it on a ship and send it over, that potentially there's a carbon footprint there. But you still have to think about, okay, well, let's weigh that up against where my electricity is coming from. A lot of the electricity that comes from in the winter is not actually green and clean anyway in the UK. And we've still got a long way to go from that end of things.
Yeah, I think you're right. Direction of travel is towards more or less completely green electricity by sometime in the 2040s. That's still very dependent on a lot of investment and a lot of plans coming off that currently, on the drawing board, but actually haven't happened. We've got to greatly expand wind much further than we have already, and that means probably onshore as well as offshore wind. A lot more big infrastructure still that needs to be developed for that to happen. And you're quite right. You do have periods of the winter when you have very cold conditions and not much wind production. there's a German word for Dunkelfeld, I think, or something like that. I think it's called. It's these sort of dark, windless sort of days that you sometimes get. These sort of climatic conditions can sometimes persist for a week or even 2 weeks at a time. And during those periods, you should rightly say, we tend to have to pull back on fossil fuels like gas to produce the electricity. So during those periods, the heat pump won't be a green appliance at all. It will be using fossil fuels to develop that electricity. That's not to say heat pumps are not important or good, and there's a lot of work going on to sort of get around that with battery storage technology, for example, and things like that, which will make us much more able to rely purely on green electricity in the future. But we're not there yet. That's probably another decade or so away before we're much closer to being able to say that's true.
So we know that OFTEC are doing quite a lot of things to try and push towards net zero, and HVO being one of them. I've also now seen that OFTEC are beginning to offer heat pump training. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? And is this training available to your members only, or is it open to people that are beyond OFTEC's membership?
We're very much wedded to this idea that you need a more technology neutral approach. And as part of that, we're keen to help all technicians, but particularly those that are already registered with us, to convert to start to work in the heat pump sector as well. And we really need to build that, because that's the potential 2026 deadline. If we don't train lots of new technicians, we could have a really serious problem on our hands, because if your boiler fails on January 1st, 2026, and you can't get an installer to replace that boiler with a heat pump, if that's what the government decides they want to do, then you can have a lot of people living in cold homes potentially for weeks on end. That could be a catastrophe for people, let alone political fallout that will result from it. We're working very hard to try and help the government with that, and as part of that, we've developed a package of training which covers air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, and also system design, which are the kind of three sort of building blocks we think that you need in order to be able to install heat pumps. So you don't have to do all those modules. You can pick and choose which one suits you. So, for example, if you're just interested in air source heat pumps, you don't have to do the ground source, of course. So it's flexible. OFTEC already has existing relationships with around about 100 training providers across the UK. We're in a really good place to try and make this happen. And so far, about 20 or so of those centres have already started to offer the heat pump courses, which is really great news, because the courses were only prepared towards the end of last summer. This has happened really quite quickly. And those courses have been developed by OFTEC in collaboration with people from across the sector, so heat pump manufacturers and a whole load of other people. So we've worked really hard to make sure that these courses are as good as they can be, and that the feedback we're getting so far is very positive. The ground source heat pump course, it isn't quite finished yet. It's currently being trialled, and that will be hopefully available in about another month or so, by which point we'll have all three starting to be rolled out in centres. I think the government has really started to wake up to the fact that training is really important. Just before Christmas, they announced a short-term scheme to provide discounts for people to do training, and that scheme has lasted for 3 months, from January to March. I think about 16 or 17 of our new centres running the heat pump training got involved with that. I'm really pleased. We've had, I think, about well over 100 technicians have now gone through those courses as a result of the government's incentivised training. We're hearing that the government is planning to do more, offer more discounts through the coming year. I'm hoping that if OFTEC can get involved with that again, we can continue to support this initiative, because clearly it's super important that if people pay the money and have a heat pump installed, they need to get a good outcome, don't they? So we really want to make sure that we're able to help that, make sure that happens.
So we're now approaching the middle of March, and where do you see the progress, or the areas that you think will be the most progressive this year for HVO? And obviously, as you were saying, your training for the heat pumps is great. Where do you think that OFTEC are really going to start to see some movements happening in 2023?
I mean, the big thing we're waiting for, well, there's actually two, maybe even three bits, actually, come to think of it. The first thing is that, let's talk about the government's proposals for off-grid first. They made their announcement and they did a consultation which finished over a year ago. And that, so far, they haven't announced anything from that. So we're still waiting to see whether they're going to bow ahead as they proposed, or whether they're going to adjust their plans. So what they come out with next is going to be really important. There's also going to be apparently a biomass strategy, which will shed quite a lot of light, I think, on the government's thinking around the use of biofuels, which it's called a biomass strategy, which implies solid biomass, but actually it will also include fuels like HVO. I think. What the government's thinking there is going to be very important in terms of whether they see a role for HVO heating. So those two things are really important. Both could potentially land this year. I hasten to add, though, that the biomass strategy was first announced in 2018, something like that. So it's been coming for a very long time. You know how things can be. It can really, it can take a very long time for this stuff to actually come through. But the consultation responses, again, need to come pretty urgently, because I think from 2024, the government's proposal was that large off-gas with non-domestic properties could be potentially affected and not be able to install a boiler anymore. So that's less than a year away. So the government's going to really need to get its skates on to make sure that the industry is ready to support whatever proposals it comes out with. My personal feeling is they're going to have to either push back that date slightly or modify the plan slightly, because I just don't really see how the installer sector is really to grip with that, essentially. You've got what you might call this kind of policy that's going on, but you've also got a political element. Because in 2024, there's going to be a general election. A lot of rural constituencies are currently held by the Conservatives. And frankly, they're not going to want to launch proposals that are potentially going to be unpopular. There's going to be a political dimension to these considerations as well. And this is where George Eustace's bill potentially could be very important. It's a private member bill, and they're not normally successful in becoming on the statute book. But it could have a significant influence in the government's thinking, and we're hopeful, and obviously we don't know exactly what's going to happen yet, but it could build George Eustace's plans into the energy bill that's currently making its way through the Lords in Parliament. And were that to happen, that could potentially open the door to the discounts for HVO that we talked about earlier becoming a reality. And were that to happen, then we really are talking about HVO becoming a realistic option again, very quickly. So we need to watch that space and see what happens. And I would encourage anybody listening to this who thinks that HVO could be a good idea to write for their MP and tell them, because I think the more MPs are encouraged to think about this as a potential option, and we're not saying HVO will be the right choice for everybody, and that's why I think it's so important that other technologies like heat pumps and indeed solid biomass too for that and to continue to be supported. It's just about choosing the right thing for the right place, really. And I think we as voters and as consumers deserve choice. So let's encourage MPs to embrace that too, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really valid point. I think it's really important that everybody out there is reminded that we are our most powerful in an election period. This is when we can really push some pressure onto our local MPs in things that really matter to you. So really do write to your local MP. There are people who are on the opposing sides as well. So go across the board and find out in all the different parties, what do you stand for with regards to heating? What is your approach with regards to heating in our area, that directly affects me? Because that's just even going to make them stop in their tracks. The fact they're going to start to be asked these questions more and more, it's going to start to make them think, okay, wow, I really need to have an opinion on this, and it needs to be one that I stand behind going forward. So I really think that that's a really valid point. So yeah, Malcolm, we need to definitely start to look at our MPs over the course of the next year and really start to find out what across the board, if you've always voted one way, that's fine, but really kind of maybe think about contacting the other MPs in the other parties to find out what their opinion is as well, so that really it will potentially end up affecting you in your home next winter.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We talked about big infrastructure that's required to help generate green electricity, and that's really important. But the big changes that are coming down the tracks that are designed to help us get to net zero are going to be the way we travel and the way we heat our homes. I would really encourage people to study once the government, all the political parties start to produce their manifesto, really scrutinise them, look at what their plans are, and think about how they might affect you. Because this is going to be quite a big challenge, and it will mean that we need to live our lives very differently to we do now, quite honestly. One of the big buzzwords is this idea of levelling up, and it is often portrayed as a north-south divide. But it's actually, there is another levelling up that needs to be addressed, and that's the difference between people who live in rural communities and those that live in towns. And I think that's going to be an important battleground in terms of the politics running up to the election. And obviously heating is front and centre of that, because the government's proposals will impact rural people very differently to those that currently live and rely on gas, basically. So whether you think that's fair or not, I think you want to have a really solid think about it, because it could have quite a big impact on the amount of money you need to spend if you need to replace your boiler.
So for me, my biggest takeaway from this interview has been that OFTEC are actually willing to engage and train their own members to be able to move away from boilers, equip them with the skills necessary to put in air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps or, different types of renewables. For me, that's a huge thing, because as Malcolm mentioned, if you have got a boiler and it does go bang, the fact that you now are going to probably pick up the phone your boiler guy, because this has been one of the biggest problems to this point, is that this has happened and they basically just slap a new boiler in because it's a quick and easy fix. Now, if the installer has got that skill set to say, okay, hang on, your boiler's gone, you've still got a year left before, we can fit a different boiler, whatever it is, we can put an air source heat pump in now. I've got the skills. Let's get it done. For me, I think that's a huge takeaway.
Yeah, and it's good to know that the OFTEC are making some progress with regards to talking to the government about, really just removing those levies and making HVO more accessible to homes. I think that's really important. I really hope that you start to see some real hard number progress in that area this year, and that you're able to come back to us at the end of the year and finally tell us that HVO is available to homeowners and a comparable price to kerosene. That to me has got to be a really key success factor by the end of this year. Good luck, and please definitely, as always, Malcolm, come back to us, give us another update. Let's hold people's feet to the fire, so to speak, or the HVO, depending on what they're using, and let's really see where we are towards the end of this year and hope that it's more positive and people have more options going into winter next year.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to come back. I think things are moving in the right direction, and I'll be very happy to give you an update once we get to next autumn.
Brilliant. Thanks, Malcolm. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.